Always trust.
We ask the question, what is needed in the world?
Dr. Paul Lowe, višestruko nagrađivani fotoreporter koji je svojim objektivom zabilježio neke od najznačajnijih događaja prošlog stoljeća. Od pada Berlinskog zida preko oslobođenja Nelsona Mandele pa sve do raspada Jugoslavije. Za Al Jazeeru govori o svojoj karijeri i motivima koji su mu bili pokretačka snaga da putuje iz jednog konflikta u drugi.
Mr. Paul, welcome to Talk to Al Jazeera.
Thank you very much.
Let's start from the beginning. What made you become a photographer? You first studied history, then documentary photography. What was so special about that media that made you decide to become what you are today?
Well, as a young boy, I was always interested in the news, in history, and what was happening in the world in current affairs. And so when I went to university in Cambridge, I got very interested in student journalism, like you do. I did some writing for the student newspaper. With a group of friends, we made a documentary film in Nicaragua because it was the anniversary of the Sandinista revolution. And I did the camera work for that, but I also did still photography with the camera. And I really felt that the still photograph and photography combined a lot of different elements together in one profession that were really interesting to me. Because you have the aesthetics of the composition, of the aesthetic side, but you also have the technical side of the camera and the equipment. But more importantly, as a photographer, you really are very often a freelance journalist, and you have a lot more control about where you go, what you do. Because as a journalist, typically you're working for one newspaper in one language, you know, The Guardian or the Sunday Times or whatever it might be, oslobađanja. As a filmmaker, you know, any documentary film you watch, at the end credits, it's hundreds of people are involved, even if you're working with a small crew, all the post-production and everything else. Whereas a photographer, you know, pretty much you could take a map of the world and take a pin and stick it in and say, I want to go there. And so you can travel very light, you can move very quickly, you don't have a lot of overheads, if you see what I mean. So that combination of the aesthetics, the technical, and the idea, and also the fact that photography is a kind of, in a sense, a universal language. You don't have to have a photograph translated into Japanese or German or French. I can have a photograph published in magazines all over the world. It's a kind of common language. So that whole combination of different elements really was very attractive to me. So towards the end of my first degree in history, I applied for a 2-year sort of postgraduate course in documentary photography. And I finished that in 1988, which was the beginning of what I kind of called the long 90s. So that period from sort of 1989 through to the early 2000s, when the world went through this enormous set of changes that were caused by the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the former socialist countries.
Yeah, you witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall, the release of Nelson Mandela.
That's right, yeah.
And then you came to this region. You were here during the disintegration of Yugoslavia. What did you see back then through your lens?
Well, I first came to what has now become the former Yugoslavia in 1990, at the beginning of the whole conflict. I was in Slovenia during that kind of 6-day war, which at the time seemed really dramatic and huge and intense, but in fact, you know, was very quickly over with relatively few casualties. And then I was in Croatia, a little bit along the border, particularly around Osijek and Vukovar. And I traveled through Bosnia before the conflict here started. You know, I did a kind of road trip. I didn't come to Sarajeva, but I went through Herzegovina, Knin, and down through Mostar. And it was very interesting then, because I met a lot of people who were saying, well, you know, it's happening in Slovenia, it's happening in Croatia, but it can never happen in Bosnia. We're too mixed, we're too intermarried, we're too interconnected. You know, if you look at the map of where we all are, you know, it could never happen here. And sadly, that kind of slightly naive optimism in the future of the country was obviously misguided, as events proved. So, yeah, so my first introduction to Bosnia was actually Bosnia at peace. And it wasn't even Bosnia then, it was still Yugoslavia.
Yeah. Photography of conflict is one of the fields that sort of defined your career. You stayed in Sarajevo during the siege. You went after that in Grozny, in Chechnya. Why? What's your drive? What makes you go in these areas, and what made you come to Sarajevo in the summer of 1992 when the fighting was very intense?
Well, I never set out to be a war photographer or a conflict photographer. I mean, as I said, my main part of my career as a photographer was this long decade of the 90s. And the first story I covered really was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that was a moment of hope and freedom and expectations that this was going to be this brave new world where liberal democracies were going to take over, and the end of communism, the end of conflict, the end of war. And obviously, sadly, that wasn't the case. In fact, if anything, the new wars of the late 19th, 20th centuries emerged at that point. And so, I didn't go out to be a conflict photographer. What I was interested in is the human condition. How people live in extraordinary situations, how ordinary people survive or live or work in extraordinary situations. So that was the kind of defining thing that I was trying to document, really, and that's what took me. And so in any of these conflicts, I wasn't particularly interested in the front lines, in the soldiers in the trenches, although I did do some photography of that. Usually I was interested in what happens to the civilian population, what happens to people in these extraordinary, like in Chechnya, who were the Chechens, what were they fighting for, what were they there for? So that's what drew me really to that kind of story, was the human experience. What drew me particularly to Sarajevo? Well, as I said, I'd already been in Slovenia and then Croatia. So at that point, Bosnia was the next domino. It was the next logical part of this ongoing story of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. So I came first in the summer of 1992 with a colleague of mine, Tom Stoddard, who sadly passed away recently, but also a fantastic photographer who did amazing work here as well. And we flew in initially on a US Air Force aid flight into Sarajevo Airport, bringing in supplies, but we weren't allowed to get off the plane because of the way the Americans had their rules. So we photographed the aid being unloaded, and then we flew to Split back with them. And in Split, Tom and I went into Oglasi, the local newspaper, and we looked for an ad for a car. So we bought a Zastava limousine for 1,500 km from some Croatian guy.
Zastava 128.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
yes.
101.
Probably,
Stojadin.
yeah, and we'd been told that if you were going to drive to Bosnia, you had to take the number plates off because the number plates were ST as opposed to SA or whatever. So we got rid of all the documentation, all the number plates. And we drove through the mountains, through Jabnica, on all the dirt roads, and we eventually got to the last checkpoint by Stup, by the airport. And we got to the last Serb checkpoint, and we were saying, we're going to Sarajevo, and the guy was like, you can do what you want, I don't care, if you want to kill yourselves, you can go. And we talked to a journalist called Ian Trainer from The Guardian in Zagreb, who told us there were two ways to get into the centre. One was to drive as fast as possible down Sniper Alley to the Holiday Inn, the big yellow thing on the left. And the other one was to try and take the back road, but he said the problem with that is it's safer, but also you might get lost and you might end up, in a minefield or something. So we thought we're going to go down the main street. So we set off as fast as we could in this car, which only did about 80 kilometers an hour. Tom was driving. I had my camera bag as if it would protect me like this. And we got through the checkpoint, through these tank traps and barbed wire, and we got maybe 200, 300, 400 meters down this road, and a guy came out in a camouflage uniform with a Kalashnikov. Stop, stand. We were very scared. Is it an ambush? Are we going to be attacked? And we stopped, and he tapped on the window, and we wound it down. He said in pretty good English, "Are you from London?" And we were like, "Yes." "You're driving on the wrong side of the road. Be very careful, you might hurt somebody. I knew you were English." We were like, this is really surreal, this is bizarre. So he was kind of a traffic cop.
The irony, you could hurt somebody during the war.
Exactly, and that was our introduction to this very surreal and extraordinary story of Sarajevo. The kind of black humor of the siege was a really defining point, I think, of the whole thing. And that was something that really struck us when we came here. There were a lot of connections, particularly between England or Britain and Bosnia or former Yugoslavia, particularly through comedy, because the whole Monty Python, Nadar Lista, Soj Lista. So we'd be sitting in somebody's basement, in candlelight, talking about, the Four Yorkshiremen sketch from Monty Python, or Monty Python, the Holy Grail, or comedy like that. So that really made us feel a very strong connection right from the very, very beginning with the story here.
How did you overcome the danger?
Well, it's always dangerous, yeah. I mean, as a journalist, you've come to do a story. You've come to tell the story. People often ask, what, do you intervene? Do you take sides? Well, a journalist's job is to tell the story as best you can, with as much authenticity and honesty as you can. Other people's job is to bring food, is to bring help, is to help people if they're wounded and so on. Although there are occasions, obviously, when you do intervene, but that's your main role. And if you can't fulfill that role, then you shouldn't be there. Now, obviously, you're scared. Obviously, there's a certain amount of fear. You do take precautions as much as you can. I mean, the beginning of the conflict, we didn't really have anything. We didn't have armored vehicles. I had a flak jacket and a helmet, but that's not that much protection. But you know, you obviously are taking calculated risks all the time. You're thinking about, you know, is there a lot of shelling? If it's a lot of shelling, you stay indoors. Is there, you know, is that particular street corner very exposed to sniper fire? You know, you're thinking maybe it's worth running, maybe it's not. Although having said that, in retrospect, now that I live in Sarajeva and I drive up on Trebević or I go to Govovica and look down, you realize, you know, just how exposed the whole city was. It's absolutely terrifying. And I think we probably had a false sense of security as journalists and as even people in the city in a sense, because places you thought you were safe, actually you probably weren't. Even in a courtyard area, you know, you could still be hit by a mortar shell. But as I said, you're taking calculated risks all the time about, you know, the value of the story, the importance of the story, and the kind of risk that you're willing to take. Now, as the war progressed, you know, the news organizations did get better organized. They had armored cars, they had better training. You know, we had medical training, things like that. But at the very beginning of the war, I mean, we were children. We didn't know what we were doing. It was, you know, we were young journalists learning things on the job, as it were.
In all the conflict areas that you have been working, you have been making history by capturing the present. Back in April this year, you held an exhibition in Sarajevo City Hall called The Siege of Sarajevo 30 years later. What do you see today? Can you make a comparison besides the obvious?
Well, having that exhibition in that venue was really a powerful experience for me, because I'd photographed inside Vieshica during the siege when it was a ruin, it was burnt down, and no one then could imagine that it could be rebuilt in such a beautiful way, in such a perfect way. So it was a very symbolic place to have the exhibition, and it's wonderful that it has been rebuilt, but in a way it's a kind of symbol of the failure to rebuild the country, because this one jewel has been rebuilt, but everything around it is still, you know, in some senses very unresolved and very unfinished. And so if you'd asked me at the end of the war where Bosnia would be 30 years later, I would have hoped that it would be in a much better place than it is today, in terms of the politics, the economics, the political structures and so on, corruption and so on. So having said that, you know, Bosnia is still here, and I think what's very interesting for me is that the country has somehow managed to survive in relative peace for 30 years. If you look at a lot of other post-conflict societies that have gone through similar traumas, they haven't. You know, conflict has broken out again. And yet the peace is still a very difficult one, because it's still very much conditioned by the way the war ended, the way that set up a very ethno-nationalist political system here, which is rife with corruption and rife with political elites and so on. And that's the great tragedy, I think, of Bosnia, that the future that was taken away from it by the war, by the conflict, has never really been returned to it by the peace.
Yeah. During the siege of Sarajevo, images from journalists like yourself were one of the main media through which the rest of the world could have a sense of what was going on here. If you look at the war in Ukraine today, the technology has really evolved. You have drones, you have body cams, people recording with their smartphones and posting directly on social medias. How is that changing the perception of war?
Well, I think there are two things here. One is the value of the still photograph and photojournalism, and I think that's still very much valuable, because photojournalists tell stories, and a lot of what we're seeing through social media, through citizen journalism, through helmet cams, there's very little context to it, and there's very little narrative to it. There are these fragmentary moments which are incredible and very powerful, but they don't tell a story, they don't tell a coherent, you know, from beginning to end. And also there's something about the still photograph, I think, that in terms of the way our memory works, it's embedded in our psyche. And I think we remember in still images, we don't remember in moving images. So I think there's still a really important role for the photojournalist, documentary photographer, even in this sort of digital age, because we are professional storytellers, and we make context, and our images then go into archives and become part of historical consciousness in a way that I think citizen media doesn't, because it still doesn't have that way of disseminating the images. So I think there's still a really important role for the photojournalist, like I was. In terms of the way that we're experiencing the conflict, though, undoubtedly this incredible rise in almost real-time live media, helmet cams, drone footage, as you said, Ukraine is the first war, I think, that's been a social media war like that. You know, we've seen elements of that in some other conflicts, but partly because the Ukrainians themselves are so technologically advanced, and they also, I think what's very interesting about the conflict in Ukraine is you're seeing simultaneously the the actual procedure or the implementation of conflict and war is they're using these tools to actually fight the war as well as record it. So the drone camera footage that we're seeing is actually being used by the drone operator to target the enemy, and then we're then seeing that as real-time news, and that's a pretty extraordinary thing. I think people have some very conflicting emotions around that. You know, you're watching an incredible piece of footage of a drone attack on a Russian armored personnel carrier, and you know that they're destroying people's lives, and yet it's this incredibly powerful, you know, footage. So I think it's a very complicated set of questions that we haven't really worked out yet in terms of how that's affecting our, you know, our response to these sorts of stories. I think obviously there's a very us and them narrative that's been created through the Ukrainian crisis and through the Ukrainian conflict, which is interesting, but it's also very, in a sense, quite dangerous, because at the end of the day, they're young men on both sides that are being killed, and old men for that matter, in the conflict. So I think there's going to be a lot of PhD theses written about the impact of social media on our perceptions of conflict through the Ukrainian experience.
In one way, images of war, of violence, or images of war are glorifying violence. People are drawn to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I have the feeling that the boundaries are constantly being pushed. If you look at the videos that we talked about of drones attacking Russian forces, or body cam images from Ukrainian forces, these are the most popular, one of the most popular categories of videos on YouTube. Why is that so?
There's something very, very compelling about this footage. I mean, a lot of people are making comparisons with video games, and I think they're quite interesting comparisons. You know, there is this sort of Call of Duty feel to some of the live footage, the helmet cam footage, the drone footage, and so on. And I think it's potentially very dangerous, because it's still a distortion of what it's really like. And we're seeing, it's not entirely sanitized, but what we tend to see in mainstream media is a romanticized or slightly sanitized view of violence. When you actually seen what happens...
Yeah, it's like watching a film of Quentin Tarantino.
Exactly, exactly. So when you actually see, you know, a person who's been blown to pieces by a mortar shell, and there's body parts everywhere and blood and guts, and it's horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous. You can't imagine how horrific it is. But we don't tend to see that. What we tend to see is the grieving mother afterwards in a kind of in almost a quasi-romanticized, you know, way. Almost looks like a Renaissance painting of grief, which is part of this long tradition of the representation of grief.
Yeah, it's a metaphor.
It becomes a metaphor. And the danger in that is that or if it's a wounded soldier, he's being carried to safety by his colleagues in a kind of heroic rescue kind of motif. And the danger in that is that we see these more sanitized versions of what violence really does. And that somehow makes it more acceptable, that we can kind of process that in our heads and think, oh yeah, yeah. Whereas if you saw the reality of it, then it would be much harder to say, we're allowing this to carry on, we must stop this, we must stop this. Well, and the same thing happened here in Sarajevo, I think. And there were a couple of moments when we saw, like for example, the Markala massacre, the pictures that were published after that were very, very brutal. And they did have a bit of an impact, because that was one of the triggers that led to NATO intervention and so on. So, but most of the time, I think we are somehow kind of distanced from the real violence of war by the media representations of it in a way that kind of allows it to continue. You know, it becomes almost acceptable.
Yeah, but where to draw the line?
It's a very good question. I think it's interesting that different societies do that differently. So, for example, in some Middle East countries, you'll see much more graphic representations. I mean, even Crna Hronika here in Bosnia, you know, they'll publish pictures of traffic victims, traffic victims that you wouldn't see published in Britain, for example. It's a very difficult question, I think. It's almost impossible to answer. I think but in general, there is a sense that we don't really understand the real reality of conflict and the real reality of violence. And because of that, we allow it to continue.
Yeah. You have been capturing people suffering all over the world. What have you learned about us as humankind? And what did you learn about yourself?
Well, I think what I found repeatedly in many situations is that no matter how horrendous the situation, people still do incredible things. So you see incredible bravery, incredible courage, resilience, strength, humor, creativity. That was really what captured my imagination and my heart in Sarajevo, and I think along with many other journalists here. It was this sense of what happens in an advanced European cultured city, civic society. What happens to people like us in that situation, you know, actors, journalists, bread makers, you know, factory workers, politics, you know, this whole kind of mise-en-scene of humanity. How do we respond? How do we react? And I think we're seeing very similar things in Ukraine as well. There is this incredible resilience, incredible creativity even in war, that people find a way to resist, to survive, to fight back with whatever there is that's essential to them. So if you're a creative person, you use creative ways to fight back. So here during the war, you know, one of the things I documented a lot, probably more than anybody else, was the way that the cultural artistic community responded. So, you know, you had people that went to the front lines as soldiers, but then came back to the artistic studio, like Nebojša Shoba, who's a good friend of mine. You know, he'd spend 2 or 3 days on the front line, then he'd come back to his studio in the art academy and he'd make art from shrapnel and so on. And that sense of fighting, not just with weapons, but also with culture, with what it means to be human, what it means to be civic society, I think was a very important part of the resistance of the siege here. You know, women who would wash their hair and keep clean and do their makeup and do their nails, you know, that was their way of resisting the aggression as well. And I think we're seeing some very, very similar things in Ukraine with the way that they are using their creativity, their intelligence to fight this war in very, very interesting and very new ways.
You are frequently coming back to Bosnia. One could say that you are almost living here or
Bosanski
living
Zet,
here.
it's Bosnian
Bosanski
son-in-law,
Zet.
yes.
What do you see today? We had elections 1 month ago. You could hear the rhetoric that's in one way similar to the rhetorics of the 90s. Does that worry you a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's the great tragedy of Bosnia is it is this incredibly beautiful country, this heart of Europe, this jewel in the center of Europe, which has managed to survive, as I said earlier, without actually conflict breaking out, which, given what happened here, it's pretty extraordinary that hasn't happened. And yet, I feel its population is still being strangled and really held back by, obviously, the way that the peace was established was set up along these very rigid ethno-nationalist lines. And in a way, that runs absolutely counter to the spirit of Bosnia-Herzegovina, because it was never, before that, a country that was built around nationalism and religion. It mixed all those different religions together, it mixed all those different belief systems together, and all those different political systems. And unfortunately, that legacy of Dayton, it's been extremely hard for the non-nationalist parties to break through that. And I think, to be honest, I think the international community deserves a lot of criticism for the way that it hasn't found a way to help this country find a better way to resolve its political situation and its economic and situation. There's obviously, and this ethno-nationalism drives corruption, it drives the political elites to keep these narratives going, because that's what keeps them in power. We've seen some little flickers of breakthrough in that. You know, obviously there were some very good successes in the last election for more democratic parties that have a different narrative. But obviously, as long as, particularly in one of the entities, the really hardcore nationalists have power, it's extremely difficult to break that. And I think that's one of the great tragedies of the way that the international community has really failed Bosnia in terms of trying to really make sure there's a really robust system to encourage democracy and to really push back against corruption and ethno-nationalism.
Do you feel that the people living in the countries of our region have learned the lessons that people like you have told through the lenses?
Well, I think it's sadly in some ways not. I think what I find very interesting about the region is I think there's a huge amount of what I would call horizontal connectedness between the different countries. You know, I go for a run every morning with my dog on Bembaša, and I see busloads of people coming from Belgrade and Novi Sad. You see a bus arrives at 8 o'clock in the morning and all the tourists pile off and they come to see Sarajevo, wonderful cultural Sarajevo, and you know, they have a great time and everything else. And obviously in music, in film, in culture, not, you know, there's this shared language, obviously, you know, beyond Serbo-Croatian, Bosnian. There's this kind of shared cultural space. And those horizontal ties, I think, are extremely powerful and extremely strong. And yet the vertical sort of separation that's still here in terms of the nationalist identities is very strong as well. And I think that's the tension that we have to try and resolve. The exhibition I had in Vijećnica on the siege of Sarajeva also opened in Belgrade at the same time in the Center for Cultural Decontamination. And, you know, it was a very successful opening. We had 150 people came, which is very good for that space. And there were a lot of young people there who were youth activists, obviously, because if they're going to come and see an exhibition about the siege of Sarajevo, they have to have some sense that they're interested in that. And these were people in their early 20s. And several of them came to me and they said, you know, until I was 20 years old, throughout my school education, I didn't even know there had been a siege of Sarajevo. It wasn't that it was denied. It wasn't that they said, oh, it's the Muslims killing themselves. It was all fake news. It was, I didn't even know it happened. So the idea that a citizen of the next capital city across, which is just a few hours drive away, could grow up to the age of 20 without knowing what happened in 1992 to 95 here is a real symbol of this, just this lack of understanding, lack of progress really across the region. And I think there's still a huge amount that needs to be done in terms of education, in terms of reconciliation, in terms of restitution. The kind of Truth and Reconciliation Committee kind of approach that happened in Germany, that happened in South Africa, has never happened here in the region. And I think until that happens, I think it's going to be very hard to break the power of the nationalist parties.
Mr. Lowe, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.